All right, we're going to jump in today, and we're going to start by looking at this scripture, and I'm just going to read it. It's a long one, so you don't have to read it out loud to me. And as I read it, I just want to prepare you. If you're thinking to yourself, ooh, I don't like this so much, don't get mad at me. Jesus Christ was the one who said this. Here we go. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. All right. If you ask my friends, my family, how to describe me, I'm sure you'd hear some descriptors like quirky. Maybe you'd hear quiet. I can be a little quiet. Maybe you heard someone say he makes up songs on the spot and he sings annoyingly to me. That would be my 4 coworkers here at church. But there's one descriptor you'd hear from a lot of people. It's 2 words, laid back. That's sort of me. I'm a chill kind of person. If we go out to a movie, dinner, I'm the kind of person who says, what do you want to do, man? I'm just go with the flow kind of person. This is how people typically experience me. But I have a secret. We've talked about authenticity last week, so in this spirit, I want to confess something to you. This laid-back, go-with-the-flow pastor of yours has a massive temper. That's right. It sort of goes against my laid-back nature, and it might be surprising. Actually, it's way better than it used to be. I've gotten a lot better. I've done a lot of work. But when I was young, it was really bad, especially while playing sports. In high school, I played football, and one dark, chilly Oklahoma Friday night, we were playing football, and I was on this punt team, and I was trying to chase down the punt returner, who was my nemesis, Josh Smith. And he locked arms with me to block me, and he had been talking trash to me all game. And in that moment, there was like these alarm bells that went off in my head, and I turned from Bruce Banner into the Hulk. And I grabbed him, and I threw him over to the sidelines, and the whistle blew, but I kept going. And I shoved him to the ground, and he was surrounded by his fellow players, his team, and I just kept hitting him until everybody dragged me off of him. Aren't you glad I'm the guy that's being called to help us become more spiritually mature? That's me. Just kidding. Now, here's the deal. After the game, after my adrenaline had worn off, you guys know what happened. I was so embarrassed. The reality was Josh was not my nemesis. We actually knew each other from, get this, church. We were a part of neighboring youth groups, and I couldn't believe what I did. And the phrase I could use, and I would use, is this phrase, I lost myself. I lost myself. In that moment of anger, all I cared about was beating someone and winning, and not only beating him down, but I lost my view of who he was. He became my targeted enemy. Destroy him at all costs. And so, as Janine already said, in these final weeks of the election season, and when I look back at the politics and the Christian church in the past decade, I can't help but think of this phrase. Have we lost ourselves? Through elections and debates and stances, the church has lost who it was meant to be. And in turn, we've lost our view of others. Churches and small groups have split over political disagreements. Christians are known just as much for vitriol and hateful rhetoric than anybody else. And we haven't just lost ourselves, but we've lost credibility in the public sector, because people have repeatedly seen Christians use their faith to bully and to manipulate and to gain power. The author Shane Claiborne writes this, it's clear that we've become known for some of the very things that Jesus spoke out against, like self-righteousness. And we haven't been known for how we love like Jesus loved. We've become known more for who we've excluded than who we've embraced, more for what we're against than what we're for. And this is why, for the next 5 weeks, we're doing a sermon series called Thou Shalt Not Be a Jerk. It's based on a book by the same name by Pastor Eugene Cho. It feels like the perfect time to have this discussion because we have lost ourselves. We have lost our view of humanity and others, and we have lost our credibility in the world. A recent Pew survey found that 65% of Americans say they often or always feel exhausted when thinking about politics. 55% often or always feel angry. Now, don't raise your hand, but is this you this morning? Exhaustion, anger, annoyance. And while the sentiment may resonate with many, it's not a sustainable approach. If we don't address it, I worry that this growing exhaustion will lead us to disconnect and withdraw right at the time when political engagement is more important than ever. See, there's sort of like a spectrum we can think about when it comes to this concept. Some of us are so tired and annoyed, we just disengage. We avoid, we numb and distract. We just let me know when it's all over. But then on the other side of the spectrum, some of us have become obsessed. We pay attention to the latest poll projections from sources. We gather all the sound bites on Twitter every morning. And our happiness and our hope gets tied in with our candidate and our party. And so we swing up or down depending on if our person wins or not. So today, in this entire series, we want to talk about how do we operate, how do we posture ourselves as followers of Jesus, finding a place where we engage and we speak up and we care about using our influence to help people, but we don't get obsessed with politics. And we forget that ultimately we are serving a different king and kingdom. Because here's the core thing to remember in this series. Our allegiance is to Christ, not political parties. And this should shape how we engage in politics. It doesn't mean we avoid and disengage, but our allegiance is not to our country or to a political party. It's to Jesus and his kingdom. Now, this topic can be so confusing and complex, we're not going to be able to cover it all in this series. So we put together a resource page on our website with some books and some podcasts and some songs, and it's not exhaustive, and we're probably going to add some more this week. But might be a good place for you to start this week. You can go to highway.org/politics to see that. But for today, I know this about Highway. I've been here about a year now. I'm looking around the room, and I know this reality. You guys are not jerks. You're not. The only time I've seen you be a jerk is when we're late getting the coffee out on time. Then things get a little weird. But Highway is mostly full of knowledgeable, kind, gentle people who would never be a jerk when it comes to political discourse. So maybe you're saying to yourself, like, this series is not for me because I know how to behave myself. But I want to be clear here. Not being a jerk is the lowest bar. It's a fun title. That's why we used it. But this is the lowest bar. The reality is Jesus calls us to so much more. So often Jesus would say, you have heard it said, but I say this. He would take a common standard and then he would call people to more. We see this in his life too. Jesus went beyond just not being a jerk, but Jesus fights for the widows, the marginalized, the poor. Jesus sees the forgotten and he embraces the sick. He welcomes children and he empowers women. If our allegiance is to Jesus, then the Sermon on the Mount is sort of like our manifesto, the declaration of a Jesus-centered life. So I actually want to offer you a challenge for this entire series and all the way up to the election. We talked as a staff this week. We thought it would be a great challenge to try and read through the Sermon on the Mount every week until the election. So once every week. On that same resource page, highway.org/politics, we broke up the Sermon on the Mount per day to help you read it through in 1 week. It's just a few chapters. And it just feels like the perfect thing to meditate on in this season. Now, our text today comes from the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus, again, says this. He says, "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies." So Jesus starts by saying, you've heard it said. And he's pointing out how people would have understood this Old Testament law. The command to love your neighbor goes all the way back to Leviticus 19:18. But then he talks about this added part, hate your enemy. Like, where did that come from? That's not in the original law. It's not in the Old Testament. Instead, it was this common misinterpretation that had crept into certain Jewish circles. And this probably came from a limited view of who your neighbor is. This would usually exclude people who weren't Jewish and who were considered enemies. Can you imagine living in a society where people use Scripture to justify hating others? It's supposed to be a snarky question. Can you imagine? I'll say it with more sarcasm. Let me turn up the sarcasm dial. Can you imagine living in a society where people use Scripture to justify hating others? That's better. Judea was under Roman occupation, and many Jews saw the Romans as their oppressors. And Jesus' teaching to love your enemies would have felt so unthinkable. Imagine someone telling you to love the very people who made your life harder. How would you respond? At the same time, Jewish society was divided into these various factions. We had the Pharisees, we talked about them last week, who were known for their strict observance of law. We had the Sadducees, the priestly class, who often worked with Roman authorities. Then we had the Zealots, a militant group that actively fought against Roman rule. These groups weren't just divided against Rome, they were often fighting against each other too. It's like our modern day, where internal conflict can sometimes seem just as fierce as the external ones. And so Jesus is challenging this cultural norm of treating others based on how they treat you, and instead he's calling us to go further, to love even those who don't love you back. How often do you do that? So, by teaching love for enemies, Jesus wasn't just clearing up a misunderstanding of the law, he was presenting a radical new way of living that challenged the social and political system of his time. And I just think it's a perfect word for us today. When we're caught up in our own divisions and conflicts, the idea of loving our enemies is just as radical as ever. Now, the word enemy can sound harsh and intense, like maybe you don't have any true enemies in life, except for the Los Angeles Dodgers. We can all agree they're an enemy. But Jesus is obviously, he's talking about any person who is on another side of an issue, who rubs you the wrong way, who you avoid conversations with. And so here's what I want to do right now in the middle of the sermon. I want to take a moment to reflect together. You might not ever admit this to anybody. You might not ever say it out loud. But I want you to think for a second, if you need to close your eyes, you can. I want you to think for a second, who is a person like this in your life? Try to picture them. It's a family member, a Facebook friend. Facebook seems to be the place where most of my enemies hang out. It's a coworker. Someone you avoid them, you can't stand to hear their takes. Someone who seems to oppose everything you stand for. I just want you to pause for a moment, picture them right now. What emotions come up? What does this stir in you? When it comes to our enemies, we don't just lose ourselves, but we lose others. We lose the humanity of them. A few years ago, social scientists highlighted this polarization that's really worse than ever, and they called it political sectarianism. And in this research, they write about this toxic cocktail, 3 areas in which has caused so much division and polarization. And actually, to highlight this teaching, we're going to be handing out free cocktails in the courtyard after the service today. I'm just kidding. Some of you guys, I got really excited, I could tell. But the rest of our sermon time, I want to highlight these 3 areas of that cause so much jerkism, so much polarization that exists in our world. So the first one is this. They highlighted this concept of aversion. This is the first recipe. Aversion in this concept means the tendency to dislike and distrust opposing partisans without even really knowing them. I've talked about this before, but I can often experience this aversion from others when they hear about what I do for a living. It's not political, but there's this immediate distrust. Like 9 times out of 10, when I meet someone in my neighborhood or at a soccer game and they inevitably ask what I do for a living, I take a deep breath and I say, Pastor. And you can see their face contort as they try to play it cool, but I see it. It's not working. And honestly, I get it in a lot of ways. When it comes to this public perception of pastors these days, it's at an all-time low. The many moral failings, the connection to hateful stances, the baggage of always trying to convert people, I get it. But also, if I'm honest, it frustrates me because I want to stop them. I want to say, just give me a chance. I promise. If you give me some time, I think I can defy your stereotypes. But isn't this what we tend to do with politics? When we hear someone has voted for that person or is passionate about that particular stance, our aversion for them causes this instant desire to avoid or distrust. Before even spending time with this person, we assume we know exactly who they are. Now, repeatedly in Jesus' ministry, he makes a point of spending time with people everyone else avoided, distrusted, and disliked. 2 examples are tax collectors and prostitutes. We talked about tax collectors last week and how despised they would have been. But then we have prostitutes. You're talking about people who would have been extremely avoided and disliked. And yet Jesus goes out of his way to get close to them. He doesn't condone everything they've done, but he engages with conversation with them. He looks them in the eye. He steps into their lives. In his book, Eugene Cho talks about this study on people's social circles and how we rarely engage with people that are different from us. The study highlights that for 75% of white people, their close social network was entirely white, with no minority presence. For black people, 65% of people said their social networks were all black. Just under half of Hispanics have a core social network that is all Hispanic. Now, this is primarily geared toward race, but I think it applies to people who share our same viewpoints and our perspectives. I mean, ask yourself right now, how often do you engage in peaceful conversation with someone that's drastically different from you? How often do you go out of your way to engage with someone who has different viewpoints without needing to beat them down with your arguments, but instead looking them in the eye? So aversion is the first ingredient of this cocktail. The second ingredient is othering. Othering. The definition of othering is the tendency to view opposing partisans as essentially different or alien to oneself. Again, Eugene Cho writes, when we dehumanize others, it can lead people to the justification of words, actions, and even policies that demean and degrade other people. For example, Nazis referred to Jews as rats. Hutus called Tutsis cockroaches in the Rwandan genocide. African Americans in the United States, both during slavery and Jim Crow, were compared with apes or monkeys. And in current times, radical monks in Burma refer to the Rohingya minority group as animals. See, othering is what happens when we divide our world into us versus them. They are insane. They are what's wrong with the world. They are bigots. They are communists. They are uneducated. They are out of touch. And we lose our view of humanity and others. We don't see the image of God in them. They become a character, a distant projection. One of the theys in Jesus' time were the Samaritans. They were thought of as less than, dirty, unclean, inferior, half-breeds. And as a result, they were otherized. They were avoided. They were over there, and we stay away from them. But in John 4:4, Jesus tells the disciples that they must go through Samaria, which was shocking. And in Samaria, how do we see Jesus engaging with the other? We see him sitting down. We see him giving this Samaritan woman human dignity by speaking and engaging in conversation like no Jew and Samaritan would have done at the time. He saw beyond her tribe, and he saw the image of God in her eyes. If we're going to find ourselves again in this context, if we're going to gain more credibility in our world, we have to find the humanity in others. Instead of dehumanizing those who have different views, we have to rehumanize them. Rehumanize them by looking them in the eyes and seeing the image of God. Sitting with them and practicing non-judgment. In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about the practice of listening and building bridges. But for now, we remember there's not us versus them. There's just us. The final ingredient in this cocktail is moralization. The tendency to view opposing partisans as iniquitous, as opposed to merely wrong-headed. So I've been in a long-standing fantasy football league. And I have to be honest with you, I spend way too much time thinking and caring about it. Like I was just checking the scores a second ago. I know I shouldn't admit that. Authenticity, I can say whatever. We already talked about my insane competitive streak. But for years, this league, the majority of the league consisted of ministers and pastors from different denominations and areas of the country. And there was a season where some of the members wanted to have discussions about some hot topics in order to foster greater understanding and dialogue. And one particular topic, I'm not going to mention it here, it was very hot. And so the premise was, let's create an open dialogue where we can feel free to be as honest as possible. And right before, no joke, right before I was about to start typing and weighing in, one member of the group said this: I love this idea, and I want to hear your opinions, but I also want to be clear, if you believe this certain perspective and stance, it is clear to me you are not fit for ministry, and you should step down from your role at church. Then, right after that, a second person chimed in and said, yes, I agree, and would throw in, I want to hear your opinion. But if you have this stance, it's clear you have been deceived by Satan. I immediately pulled my hands back from the keyboard. I realized this was not the open dialogue I thought it was. And this is the concept of moralization with an issue like this. If you disagreed with them, it wasn't just that you were ill-informed or maybe ignorant, but you are morally inferior. You are on the opposite side of God, and you deserve the punishment that should go with that viewpoint. So I decided not to talk about these hot topics, and I just beat down their souls in fantasy football in the name of Jesus. And this is where we find ourselves in the political culture. It's not just that you have different ways of viewing policies or strategies, but if you're on the other side, you're actually a bad person. You are morally inferior. Something is internally messed up with you. Again, in the life of Jesus, you don't have to look hard at him consistently upending people who thought they were morally superior. He's constantly embarrassing and frustrating religious people who assume they have it all figured out. So a question to think on. We have to ask ourselves, where have I turned my political preferences into a test of moral or spiritual superiority? Because when you think about it, this entire cocktail, this entire series comes down to humility. The ability to say, maybe I don't know. Maybe I don't know at all. Maybe I need to lay down my strongly held opinions and assumptions and decide to engage with others. In 1994, for around 100 days, in what would eventually be called the Rwandan genocide, around 1 million Rwandans were killed. It was a complex set of issues that started it, but regardless of the reasons, what ended up happening was family members killed family members, neighbors killed neighbors. Now, here's the crazy part. Rwanda is a predominantly Christian nation, with over 90% of the population claiming the Christian faith, claiming to follow this way of love. So how could this happen? They lost themselves. They lost who they really were. Many places of worship played a role in the genocide, often being used as death traps. And now, on this day, Rwandan Christian leaders, they provide educational tours and retreats for other global Christian leaders in attempts to warn them. Don't let happen in your country what happened in our country. They warn them of the dangers of placing allegiance in anything but Jesus. Because this allegiance to a party or a cause or a tribe can quickly lead to losing sight of the true kingdom. It might seem like an extreme example, I get it. But this is what can happen when we dehumanize others and we lose sight of the image of God in them. Now, contrast that story with another horrible global tragedy. For many in the country of Lebanon, the enemy is Syria. Another complex situation during the 70s, there was a civil war, and Syria occupied Lebanon for a series of months, a year, perpetrating violence and fear. And there's a pastor and author, Leanne Friesen. She writes about visiting some Lebanese Christians, many who had lost loved ones to the Syrian violence. And one in particular was a pastor whose father had been killed by Syrians. But, you might know this, in the past 15 years, things have changed drastically as millions of Syrian refugees now take refuge in Lebanon. And so it provides this tension point for these Christians because these are their enemies. Those who brought fear and violence and war and occupation are now living with them. And in the midst of these tensions, the same pastor whose father was killed by Syrians, at a church gathering, not unlike ours, he brought a Syrian refugee up to the front of the congregation. And what did he do? In front of everybody, he brought this refugee to the front and he washed his feet. It's an ancient symbol of servanthood, symbol of surrender, a symbol of humility to his enemy. This is how you treat enemies in the kingdom of Jesus. You wash their feet. Now this church has grown from 60 people to around 900 people, mostly consisting of Syrian refugees. Lost and found. We can lose ourselves. We can lose our calling. Maybe we have, maybe you have, but we can find it again. We can find our way back to this countercultural way, this backwards, upside-down kingdom that defies policies and partisanship by swearing allegiance to a king who dies for his enemies. So today we're going to take one practical step. In following weeks we're going to cover other areas, but one practical step today to being countercultural is we're just going to give you a moment and we're going to pray for our enemies. And so if you would, I want to invite you to close your eyes, bow your head if you want to do that. And maybe it was the person that you pictured earlier on in the sermon. Maybe it's a bigger figure, a political figure. But I want you to come up with one or two people that would be your enemies, people that rub you the wrong way, that you just can't believe they do or think the way they think. And then I'm just going to give you some space to be with Jesus. And I want to give you some space to actually pray for those enemies, to will the good for them. So take some space and pray for them. We'll come back.